In this video, we're going to cover the question, what is unfinished business? So let's start by looking at the difference between unfinished business and old business. Unfinished business is the topic of this video and something that we're going to dive into to make sure that we fully understand what it is, where it comes from, and what to do with it. Old business, on the other hand, is a term that should never be used in parliamentary law. But it is a term that you are likely to hear being used in meetings. It can be misleading, and it doesn't accurately refer to any particular class of business as we know it in the parliamentary world. It's one of those slangs that just seems to stick around and get in the way. Here's what Robert's Rules of Order has to say about it. The expression old business should be avoided, since it may incorrectly suggest the further consideration of matters that have been finally disposed of. So since we're avoiding the term old business, just go ahead and remove it from your vocabulary right now. Never again think in terms of old business. We're going to replace that with a proper parliamentary term, unfinished business. This is the term that you will actually find in parliamentary text and in the standard order of business. So what is unfinished business? Where does it come from and how is it created? Let's take a look. Unfinished business is created in any one of three ways. A meeting adjourns while a motion is pending. A meeting adjourns before reaching existing items of unfinished business, or a meeting adjourns before reaching general orders set for that meeting. You'll notice that all of these involve a meeting's adjourning before some item of business has been completed, and that is what creates unfinished business. We'll start with the first case. A meeting adjourns while a motion is pending, and we'll look at an example of how this might happen and how it is handled. Let's say at the monthly meeting in January, the standard order of business is used, and after all the headings have been covered, the meeting arrives at new business. At this point, let's say a member obtains the floor and makes the motion that $100 shall be donated to the ABC Foundation. It receives a second, the chair places it before the assembly for consideration, and members take turns debating the motion. But let's say during debate on the motion, the assembly decides that it has spent long enough in the meeting and adjourns. So the meeting adjourns while the motion is still pending. What happens to the motion? And yes, this is allowed. Many people are under the impression that a meeting can't be adjourned while a motion is pending. But in the normal case, as applies to most meetings, it is perfectly appropriate to adjourn while a motion is pending. The general principle is stated in Robert's Rules of Order as the following. A majority should not be forced to continue in session substantially longer than it desires. Still, though, the question remains, what happens to the motion that was pending? It wasn't adopted, of course, because no vote was ever taken on it, but it wasn't lost either. So let's take a look at what happens at the next month's meeting. At the February meeting, the Assembly will once again go through its standard order of business, starting with the reading and approval of the minutes and continuing through the reports. Then, after special orders, if there are any, we arrive at the heading of unfinished business and general orders. At this point, the motion that was pending when the previous meeting adjourned, that is, the motion that was just left hanging when everyone decided to go home, magically returns and will once again become the pending question before the assembly. The chair would introduce it by saying, for example, under the heading of unfinished business and general orders, the first item of business is the motion to make a donation to the ABC Foundation, which was pending when the last meeting adjourned. The chair would then state the question on the motion by saying, the question is on the adoption of the motion that $100 shall be donated to the ABC Foundation. Members can then debate the motion, and when the debate is finished, the motion is put to a vote. Let's say, in this case, the motion is adopted. Then, if there is no further unfinished business or general orders, the meeting proceeds to new business. And when new business is finished, the meeting adjourns. Now, for our next example, let's move on to the next month's meeting, the March meeting. Here, let's say a motion is being considered that the clubhouse shall be painted pink. And during its consideration, the motion is postponed to 2:00 p.m. because the Assembly wants to consider other, more important matters first. So the Assembly moves through its other business for a few hours until 1:30 p.m., when the members decide that they've had enough for the day and vote to adjourn. So the postponed motion was not reached before adjournment. It wasn't actually pending at the time the meeting adjourned, like our first example, but still it hasn't been put to a vote, so it hasn't been finally disposed of yet. This means that when we get to April's meeting, we will move through the standard order of business just as usual, and when we arrive at unfinished business and general orders, our motion will surface. And the chair will introduce it by saying, for example, the next item of business is a motion related to painting the clubhouse, which was postponed at the last meeting but not taken up before adjournment. The question is on the adoption of the motion that the clubhouse shall be painted pink. The motion is then debated and finally put to a vote. And just for fun, let's say it is adopted, and let's adjourn April's meeting. Now, to demonstrate a third way that unfinished business arrives at a meeting, let's go to May's meeting. And let's say a motion is being considered that a new printer shall be purchased for the office. And let's say that the Assembly votes to postpone the motion to next month's meeting. When we arrive at the next month's meeting, the June meeting, that motion is a general order. It still comes up under the heading of unfinished business and general orders, but only because it is a general order. It's not unfinished business at this time. However, if that meeting adjourns before taking up the motion, then when the next meeting arrives, July's meeting, the motion is now unfinished business since it wasn't reached at last month's meeting, and it will stay unfinished business until it is reached. While it is very uncommon for unfinished business to not be reached in a meeting, it is theoretically possible for an item of business to remain as unfinished business meeting after meeting indefinitely, but only if each meeting adjourns before disposing of the motion in question. The point is that unfinished business has to be dealt with. You can't just wait for it to go away, because it won't. But this is rarely ever an issue, because the term unfinished business refers to a very specific class of business in parliamentary law. It isn't, as many people think, simply anything that any member wants to drag up from the past. In fact, most motions that members think are unfinished business, or that they would characterize by using that dreaded term, old business, are actually examples of new business. For instance, let's say a motion was adopted in the January meeting that a new refrigerator shall be purchased for the office at a cost not to exceed $500. But by February's meeting, that purchase hasn't been made yet because a refrigerator suited to the needs of the office couldn't be found for that price. So let's say at February's meeting, a member wants to move to amend the motion by striking out $500 and inserting $1,000 so that it would read like this. Would this be an example of unfinished business, old business, or new business? Pause the video if you'd like more time. Before we look at the correct answer, we know we can rule out old business because we've taken that out of our vocabulary since it doesn't represent any class of business in parliamentary law. So that's gone. That leaves us with unfinished business and new business. Even though this amendment would affect a motion that was previously adopted and that hasn't been executed yet, the proposal to change 500 to 1,000 is new business. So unless this motion arises out of a report of an officer, board, or committee, or the Assembly votes to take the motion up earlier than usual by making it a special or general order, or by suspending the rules to take it up ahead of its time, it would come up under the heading of new business near the end of the meeting. It would never come up as unfinished business in the February meeting because it didn't come over from the January meeting as a result of an adjournment. We won't go into all the rules and procedures for special orders in this video, but just keep in mind that if an item of business is a special order and it isn't reached in one monthly meeting, it remains a special order for the next monthly meeting. So it would not come up under unfinished business. It would come up earlier than that under special orders because it's special. So unfinished business is never a surprise. That's why Robert's Rules of Order states, the chair should not announce the heading of unfinished business and general orders unless the minutes show that there is some business to come up under it. In the latter case, he should have all such subjects listed in correct sequence in a memorandum prepared in advance of the meeting. He should not ask, is there any unfinished business, but should state the question on the first item of business that is due to come up under this heading. And when it has been disposed of, he should proceed through the remaining subjects in their proper order. So we see that unfinished business is a matter of fact. It's not a matter of opinion. The chair or the parliamentarian or the secretary or whoever is preparing the materials for the meeting should check for unfinished business well in advance of the meeting. Often when looking over the order of business, the chair will ask me how the heading of unfinished business should be handled. Should unfinished business be called for? In most cases, I'm able to say, there is no unfinished business, so we'll skip over that heading. If I have identified items of unfinished business, I simply include them in the script. The chair never asks for unfinished business in the meeting because unfinished business can't arise in the meeting. It must exist before the meeting if it is to exist at all. So, how do you check for unfinished business? Well, it involves answering 3 simple questions. First, was a question pending when the previous meeting adjourned? And keep in mind that question is a parliamentary term for motion. So we're asking, was a motion pending when the previous meeting adjourned? If so, that's unfinished business, and you should make a note of that and include it in the presiding script. Second, was there unfinished business that hadn't been reached when the previous meeting adjourned? If so, that carries over to the next monthly meeting as unfinished business. And third, were there general orders that hadn't been reached when the previous meeting adjourned? If so, those too become unfinished business at the next monthly meeting. And finally, there's that 4th detail that should be remembered, and that's simply that special orders remain special orders. So any special orders that aren't reached in one session would come up under the heading of special orders at the next session. Another important aspect of unfinished business to keep in mind is that questions only come over from the previous session as unfinished business when the regular business meetings are not separated by more than a quarterly time interval. For example, if a regular meeting is held in January, a quarterly time interval would span over the next 3 months to April, and a regular meeting held any time in April would be within a quarterly time interval. So if the regular meeting in January adjourns before completing its business, items of business that were set to be taken up in that meeting, but that were not reached, will travel over to the April meeting as unfinished business. However, if the next regular meeting is beyond a quarterly time interval, items of business will not travel to that meeting as unfinished business. But of course, those items of business that were not reached at January's meeting could be introduced anew at any subsequent session if they're still applicable. As a final note, in a session that has meetings over multiple days, where each day has items scheduled to be considered, unfinished business works a bit differently. For example, if the meeting on day 1 goes through its business but adjourns before all items are considered, or if an item is pending when the meeting adjourns, any such items of unfinished business are taken up at the beginning of the meeting on day 2. And after the business on day 2 is considered, if there are any items of business that were not reached or that were pending when the meeting adjourned, those items are taken up at the beginning of the meeting on day 3. That covers the question, what is unfinished business?